Typhoon Haiyan, a super typhoon stronger than Hurricane Katrina and Sandy combined, unleashed its wrath on the Philippines in November of 2013. It was only days before that the opening of the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Warsaw, Poland kicked off. The attendants were questioning if man-made climate change could be the trigger for the increasing and more frequent extreme weather.
Typhoon Haiyan, one of the strongest storms ever recorded. Thousands dead in his homeland, the Filipino Climate Change Commissioner staged a hunger strike at the UN climate talks, demanding delegates take action.
We can fix this. We can stop this madness right now, right here, in the middle of this football field, and stop moving the goalposts.
A recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states that heavy rainfalls associated with tropical cyclones are likely to increase with continued warming. The report also says that average tropical cyclone maximum wind speed is likely to increase.
As we all know, global climate change is a crisis that is absolutely going to wait for no one, and it respects no border. It's happening now, and it's happening at a pace that is alarming to all of us.
According to a recent World Bank report, loss and damages from disasters have risen dramatically over the years, from an annual average of around $50 billion in the 1980s to just under $200 billion over the past decade. And weather-related economic impacts are especially high in fast-growing middle-income countries, while they're particularly crippling in smaller and lower-income countries that are least able to cope with them.
Joining me now to discuss both sides of this issue from Miami, oceanographer and explorer John Englander. He's also the author of the book High Tide on Main Street. And with me here in the studio, Marlo Lewis, Jr. He is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a Washington, D.C.-based libertarian think tank. Welcome to the show, both of you. Let me start by just talking about the developments we've seen recently. You know, of course, there's Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, Hurricane Sandy here in the U.S. not too long ago, these violent, destructive weather systems. And a lot of people are asking, is there a linkage between extreme weather and climate change? And John, why don't I start with you? Is there?
Well, it's hard to associate any individual storm and say that that's a result of climate change. But what we do know is that storms are driven by ocean heat, and the oceans are almost a degree Celsius or 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than they were a century ago. And the currents in the oceans are changing. As a result of that, storm patterns are changing. And we're probably going to see more stronger storms, but it's hard to correlate one-to-one.
Marlo, would you agree?
Well, ocean heat is certainly a factor, but there are many factors that go into making a hurricane. And I think what's interesting is that if you look at the last, say, 50 to 70 years, depending on the ocean basin that you're examining, you're not seeing any long-term trend in either the frequency or the strength of landfalling hurricanes. You're not seeing an overall trend since the early 70s, for example, in a measure of hurricane strength called accumulated cyclone energy. Right now, the accumulated cyclone energy in the North Atlantic is about 30% of the average from 1970 to the present. And globally, it's about 70%.
Okay, but John, you've got a title of your book, High Tide on Main Street, which makes me think that you think this is pretty serious and it should be addressed.
Sure. Listen, there are four things that correlate very well over hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years, and I will stand on that. And that is that the long-term average global temperature correlates with the size of the glaciers and ice sheets on the planet. And as the ice sheets and glaciers melt, the ocean rises hundreds of feet, and as the ocean level rises, the shoreline moves inland. Now, we've been fooled because for the last 4,000 to 6,000 years, sea level hasn't moved much. Our entire human civilization has existed during kind of an intermission of sea level change. Sea level goes up and down about 350 feet with each ice age. That's a really good correlation, and it's simple physics. Anybody can understand that. If you melt 2 miles of ice, you're going to get hundreds of feet of sea level rise.
Let me, is it worse than ever? Would you say it's worse than ever?
Well, no, I think it's better than they've told us. But really, this is the first time, John, this is the first time I've ever heard a scientist claim that right now we should be going into the next glaciation and sea levels should be falling. That's a surprise to me. The orbital mechanics is, I'm not an expert in the orbital mechanics, but as far as I know, that's still several thousand years off. And I know that some people say that the extra CO2 in the air will prevent that from happening, but I've never heard a scientist claim that right now sea levels would be falling, but because the ice sheets would be expanding.
John, why don't you respond,
Marlo,
and then I want to move on.
Sure, Marlo, and maybe Mike will have us back after you've read my book, Marlo, but it's pretty well known in any geology textbook for the last 50 years that the ice age cycles are 100,000 years roughly, called the Milankovitch cycles. They vary between 95 and 125,000 years if we want to be precise. And sea level has risen for the last 20,000 years. 20,000 years ago, sea level was 400 feet straight down from where it is today. And if you don't know that, you need to go back and look at some basic geology.
Okay, you don't have to be insulting. I do know that. What I don't know is that the ice age is going to start tomorrow, but for the coal-fired power plants.
I did not say tomorrow. I said that after 20,000 years of rise. I didn't say that, Marlo. Don't put words in my mouth.
Well, let me go, John. Let me talk about Warsaw. What just happened there, and there are a lot of people, I believe, in your camp who are just arguing that what the law provides and what the planet needs, they're just not. There's a huge gap between those, and that there needs to be action, and countries need to take this seriously and make a move on it now. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think we do need to deal with the emissions of carbon dioxide, but I take a very different conclusion, actually, because even if we did a perfect job with carbon emissions, even if we could stop them today and invent perfect solar and wind and so on, and not put another molecule of CO2 in the atmosphere, sea level's still going to rise because the oceans are warmer, abnormally warmer. Here in Miami, where I'm in the studio, they get several days a month, the streets are flooding because the water's backing up through the storm drains. That didn't happen 20 years ago.
Well, Marlo, let me turn to you. You know, John's saying, hey, we need to lower carbon emissions. You don't seem that nervous about it.
No, I'm not that nervous about it. There are two studies that have come out recently, both in the journal Science, and one estimates that the actual amount of sea level rise from the shedding of ice on Greenland over the next 2 centuries will be about 1 inch. The other one estimates that the actual shedding of ice from the West Antarctic ice sheet will translate into 1 inch of sea level rise. So yes, if you get a warmer ocean, the water will expand, and you may get as much as a foot of sea level rise in this century. But we had about half that much in the last century, and we adapted to it. A lot of people adapted to it without even knowing that it was sea level rise they were adapting to.
Okay.
This is not a crisis, it's not an emergency, and we could see even less sea level rise than that.
Okay, I want to give you a chance, John.
Yeah, Marlo, I mean, what you're doing is you're taking 2 articles out of Science magazine from the last couple of years that support your case, and you're implying to the audience.
I'm citing
that's
science. I
representative.
can't cite hundreds of articles on the air. We don't have time.
Okay, but you obviously are selecting the ones to make a case. There are other articles, and one published in just the last couple of weeks, which says that a survey of 90 climatologists says that we could get between 2 to 4 feet of sea level rise this century. And there are a lot of studies showing what's happening in Greenland and Antarctica that I'm sure you're aware of and are just choosing not to cite, which say that if things happen like the methane release, which is far worse than we thought, according to a recent study, or the West Antarctic ice sheet, which is loosening up, we could get catastrophic sea level rise.
If you think it's unstoppable, then it doesn't make sense to slam the brakes on the global economy when the industrialized economies are having a very bad economic time to begin with, and there are still people in the developing world who don't even have access to electricity. If this is going to happen anyway, then what we need is the wealth in order to invest in technology to adapt to whatever circumstances the global climate throws at us, whatever the cause, or whether it's human-induced or whether it's natural. And so we could shut down every coal-fired power plant, every factory, every automobile in the United States tomorrow, and according to the IPCC science, that would only avert 0.2 of a degree of global warming by the end of the century, and we would be destitute. And so we would still have all the global warming except 0.2 of a degree, but nothing, no resources with which to adapt to it. So this whole view that we've got to shut down the world's energy economy to save the planet is so wrong-headed.
Marlo, why are you?
I'm going to have to. We're going to have
I'm not attributing that to you, John, but I'm just saying, in fact, you seem not to have an interest in that agenda. I think that agenda is far more dangerous than climate change.
I don't know why you're bringing that up. Mike didn't even ask you about that.
He did.
The issue of do we need some mechanisms to incentivize us as a world to get off of carbon is a fair question.
Okay, and we're going to have to, I'm sorry, John, we've run out of time. I wish we had more time to discuss this, but it was fiery. There was some heat. I appreciate both of you joining us. Thank you.